Welcome to Professor Ortlieb's Bluebook podcast, a series of podcasts designed to teach 1L students the basics of legal citation using the Bluebook. In the last episode, we finished out our review of Bluebook Rule 10.2.1, and we also reviewed Bluebook's general rules on style, including abbreviations, numerals, and symbols under Rule 6. In this episode, we will look at Bluebook's rules for quoting material under Rule 5. You'll want to have a copy of your Bluebook in front of you as you watch this podcast. As with many Bluebook rules, Blue Pages contains shorter summary rules for every one of these rules. You can find the shorter summary rules for Bluebook Rule 5 in Blue Pages Rule B5. Rule 5.1a teaches us how to format quotes of 50 or more words. An abbreviated practitioner's guide to this rule can be found in Blue Pages Rule B5.2. Quotes that are 50 or more words long are known as block quotes. They get this name from their appearance in the text. These quotes should be indented from the normal margin on both the left and the right. They are single-spaced. Because block quotes are set off from the text by these indents, you would not use quotation marks at the beginning or end of the material. If your block quote contains a quote of another authority, or an internal quotation, you should retain the quote marks around these internal quotations. The site for a block quote appears on the next line after the quote ends. The quote should line up with your main text margin, not the block quote's indented margin. Using a hard return and double-checking your margins should help you realign your text. Now take a look at these examples from pages 82 and 83 of the Bluebook. These show how to format longer material, including quotes of multiple paragraphs. Note here, you do double indent the first line of your block quote if the first word in your block quote is also the first word of the paragraph in the original. But don't double indent or use an ellipsis if you have omitted language from the start of the original paragraph in your block quote. Do use indentation and ellipsis when omitting a material at the start of subsequent paragraphs in the same block quote, as you can see here. When you're eliminating a paragraph or more of material, you'll use 4 periods indented on their own line to indicate that you've omitted one or more paragraphs in the middle of the block quote. Quotes of 49 or fewer words are governed by Rule 5.1b and Blue Pages Rule B5.1. Because these quotes will not be set off from your main text like a block, you'll need to use quotation marks to indicate the quoted material. If your quote contains an internal quotation, you should indicate the internal quote with single quote marks. For these shorter quotes, you won't retain paragraph structure from the original, but some material, like dialogue or poetry, has a natural paragraph structure or hard line breaks. Therefore, if your quoted material is dialogue or poetry, you should format it as a block quote, regardless of length. Remember to place periods and commas inside of your quotation marks. Other punctuation is going to appear outside of the quotation marks. If other punctuation appears inside the quotation marks of the original, you should put it inside the quotation marks of your text. Quotes work best when they're incorporated into your own text and prose seamlessly. In order to make a quote work with your text grammatically, you may need to make slight alterations to the original. Rule 5.2 shows you how to make those alterations. When changing the case of letters, enclose the change letter in brackets, like this. Similarly, if you need to substitute words or insert material into a quote, enclose such changes in brackets. If, on the other hand, you are omitting letters from a word, indicate the omission with empty brackets at the end of the root word, like this. At times, the original material may include typos, misspellings, or other errors. Significant mistakes in the original can be left as is, with sick in brackets inserted immediately following the error. Be careful with your use of sick, though, as overuse can make you look like a pompous know-it-all. Nevertheless, if repeated errors are part of your theory of the case or a significant fact, including the errors and SICs may be appropriate. Here's an example of what a SIC looks like. Some changes to quoted material should be noted in the citation that follows the quote. If you add emphasis to the original quote, or if you omit internal citation, emphasis, or footnote call numbers, you should report those alterations by adding a parenthetical describing your alteration to the end of the citation. You can see examples of such parentheticals on page 84 of your Bluebook. If you omitted a cite or footnote number that appeared after the last word you quoted, you don't need to indicate that in the parenthetical. Finally, you shouldn't indicate emphasis in the original. Whenever you have an internal quotation, you should attribute the internal quote to the original source. Insert such information as a parenthetical at the end of the citation. This form of parenthetical comes after any other parenthetical listed in Rule 5.2. Be sure to format citations within the parentheticals according to the usual rules for formatting citations. In short, be sure to refer to the blue pages in your prior rules about citation. Here is an example of how you would format the citation for a quote within a quote taken from page 84 of your Bluebook. The text uses different colors to show you which text corresponds to each portion of the cite. In this example, you have quoted extensively from Marx, which quotes Weissman. Because the primary source you've quoted or relied on is Marx, you would list that as your main cite, and that is indicated with the purple text. The internal quote from Weissman, indicated in red, is shown with single quotation marks in the quote, and the cite is added as a parenthetical at the end. Note that the parenthetical indicating the source of the internal quote appears after the parentheticals indicating that this was from a concurring opinion and indicating that you added emphasis to the quote. I showed that here with green text. An additional sample of quotes within quotes can be found on page 8 of your blue pages. When you omit some material from your quote, you need to indicate the omissions according to Rule 5.3 found on pages 85 and 86. Be sure to make liberal use of these pages, as they contain numerous examples that will help illustrate each of these rules that can be confusing on their own. In general, use an ellipsis to indicate omitted material. Do not use an ellipsis to begin a quote, nor should you use an ellipsis when words are merely altered. Omitted footnotes or citations are indicated with parentheticals, not ellipses. When you weave quoted material into your text, such that you're quoting only a phrase or a clause from the original, you do not need an ellipsis to indicate that you omitted material before or after the quote. You would use an ellipsis in these quotes only if you cut words from the middle of the quotation. On the other hand, when you're using quoted language as a full sentence, you're going to want to follow these conventions. If you omitted material at the start of the quote, do not use an ellipsis, but instead capitalize the first letter of the first word that you used, and place that letter in brackets. If you omit material in the middle of the sentence, use an ellipsis to indicate the omission. Finally, use an ellipsis to indicate omitted material at the end of the original sentence. Don't forget to include the sentence's punctuation after the ellipsis, as shown here and emphasized by the underscore. Ellipses are also used to indicate the omission of sentences or clauses in multi-sentence quotations, where your quote retains a full sentence from the original, but then omits subsequent material before starting up again. Indicate that omission by placing an ellipsis after the punctuation from the first sentence. In this example, I've shown you that my first sentence was retained in full and ended with a period. I placed 2 spaces after the period according to traditional typesetting conventions, and I inserted my ellipsis. Because I picked up the quote in the middle of the sentence of the original, I've capitalized the first letter of the first word I used and put it in brackets. Finally, if omitting language at the end of a sentence, adding additional material after that, use only one ellipsis to indicate the omitted material. In this first example, note how even though the writer omitted material both at the end of the first sentence and the start of the second sentence, the ellipsis was placed before the period indicating the end of the first sentence. Again, the second sentence uses bracketed E to show that the quote is picking up again mid-sentence in the original. This second example may make it easier to see the placement of that ellipsis because the original language contains a question mark. You can find these examples and others again on page 86 of your Bluebook. What you may notice here, though, is that the dots that indicate spacing in the Bluebook do not show the two spaces at the end of a sentence. Remember that we do follow some of the old school sort of typography, keeping two spaces at the end of every sentence. So make sure you include that extra dot or that extra space in your homework and your daily work. You've now completed Bluebook podcast number 7, Bluebook lesson number 7. If you have any questions, please see me or your TA.